GLUT1 is an energy crisis in brain. So what happens is that your brain can only work on glucose. It's just like an engine that works on fuel. So if you don't get glucose into the brain, you have an energy crisis, and that's what happens in GLUT1 deficiency. It's just like you have an engine and you can't get the petrol in because the petrol pump is broken. Unfortunately, you can run this engine with a different fuel, just like running a car with alcohol rather than with gasoline. Is that you use a physiological rescue mechanism, which is fasting. Because in fasting, the brain doesn't rely on glucose, it relies on ketones, and the ketones are produced from fat, and this is basically the mechanism you can treat GLUT1 deficiency effectively. That's if you offer ketones as an alternative fuel by using the ketogenic diet. There was always concern about high-fat diets and cardiovascular risk. Do patients end up with strokes or with heart attacks when they're at the age of 30 and 40 and still on the ketogenic diet, or have been on the ketogenic diet for years and years? So there was data coming in on follow-up from different groups, and this data was worrying because they followed patients for 6 months, for 12 months, for 15 months, and they saw that the blood lipids increased and that there was arterial stiffness of the carotid artery. So they said, well, maybe you run into trouble with cardiovascular problems when you take the ketogenic diet. But then there were other data that when you continued to follow these patients for another couple of years, suddenly things normalized. So you seem to have a short-term bad effect, but then these seem to level off. And we were in the fortunate position that we are treating GLUT1 patients. We're seeing them on a regular basis. And there were 10 patients that we've seen for 10 years. So we decided to write that data, bring it into a paper. And after 10 years, we checked on their arterial status of do they have atherosclerosis by doing ultrasound of the carotid artery and monitoring the blood lipids over 10 years. And what was the result was that we found that actually, at least in these 10 patients, they all returned to normal and there was no sign of cardiovascular risk, which is encouraging, but of course it's a small cohort, but it's the only really long-term study that has looked at fatty acids and cardiovascular risk on a ketogenic diet. And I think it's representative for all ketogenic diets, not just for GLUT1 deficiency on ketogenic diets. When we first investigated GLUT1, when I was with Dr. DeVivo's team, we thought we had a great mechanism. We understood why the problem occurred. It's just this transporter not getting glucose in, and we have the energy crisis in brain. And then we said, well, we have a good treatment, that's a ketogenic diet, and isn't that a great story? And then with more and more patients identified, we saw that there's much more to the story than that. It's much more complex. There are different phenotypes, meaning that patients have different problems. Some have just epilepsy, some have just a movement disorder. They don't all have the classical phenotype. Some of them didn't respond to the ketogenic diet as well as we thought. And then as our children grew older, we realized that in adolescents and in adults, GLUT1 deficiency changes. It changes in symptoms and it changes in response to the ketogenic diet. First of all, you can't use a strict ketogenic diet in adults. It's very, very hard. But then the epilepsy, which is the main problem in infants and small children, sort of is replaced by movement disorders and dystonia and paroxysmal events in the adults. So we had to rethink, and we had to understand that our understanding of GLUT1 deficiencies has to be much more complex, and that we have to find other treatment options on top of the ketogenic diet, because obviously the ketogenic diet didn't do the trick for all the symptoms and not in any age. So I think the step that took it further was to have the patient grow with the patients into adolescence and adulthood. And of course, the necessary step is to convince adult neurology now. Now, the pediatric neurologists all know about Glut1 and they are all aware of it, and it's well accepted in the scientific community. But adult neurologists are not really interested in Glut1 deficiency. They treat it as a very rare disease, and the ketogenic diet can't be done anyway in adults. So we have to motivate them to look into that. And I think this is happening at the moment, and this is really important. Also, it will bring total numbers of patients we identify up dramatically if you look into the adult community. And you see, on the other side of the life spectrum, we have to look into the very young children. We have to develop a screening method to screen for Glut1, to treat them as early as possible. We have to look into the babies and see how fast we can identify the disease in order to give them the best treatment available for their brain to grow, so that we just don't follow them and then treat symptoms, but to get them as early as we can and help them efficiently.